Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. It's Monday, the 5th of April, and it's quite cool and cloudy today, but the weather forecast is looking pretty good. Wednesday, cloudy but warm. Thursday, Friday, looking sunny and nudging 60. So I think this week I will be going into my brood chambers for the first time. I'll be quick. I don't want to do too much manipulations or anything like that, but I want to see just how well those brood chambers have developed. I've been putting on pollen substitute patties and dry pollen substitute for the bees to forage on now for almost 4 weeks, and so looking back on the calendar, round about the 12th, 11th, 12th, 13th of March, it was, we had our first little warm spell. That's when I got my first pollen on. And I'm hoping that some of the colonies will have started to rear brood in earnest then. Though we did go into a little bit of a cold 4 or 5 days after that, and it wasn't really until about the 19th, 20th, to about the 24th, 25th of March that temperatures really consistently for almost a week or so got into the high 50s and 60s. And I got round and got another pollen patty in to all of the hives, as my hives had been eating them then. So I am very hopeful that I have a lot of hives where capped brood is now starting to emerge, or there's a fair amount of capped brood about to emerge in the coming 5 to 7 days or so. And that should see my populations of my colonies really start to grow. And from there on in, I can start to think about splitting my hives. I had another exceptionally good winter with survivorship. Well over 90%, and as a consequence my hives are doing much better than I dared hope, and as a result I need to make a whole lot more supers because I'm going to be out of deep boxes very quickly. I have a lot of my hives that came through the winter as single deeps, and they're going to need another brood chamber on in the coming few weeks. And although I know I've got enough brood chambers to just about cope with that, I also plan to be splitting quite a few hives. So I'm going to need quite a few empty brood chambers built. So I am busy making brood chambers, and I'm going to be knocking together a whole lot more today and tomorrow in preparation for growing those colonies that have been fed and doing well so far. Even my 5-frame nukes, 11 out of 12, or is it 9 out of 10? I can't remember if I've got 10 or 12 that went into the winter, but I know they only lost 1, so I am delighted. The bees, as well as having pollen substitute to forage on, they've had, I've had sugar syrup. On some of the hives I put on the lightest hives, I put a bucket feeder directly onto the brood chamber or on the top of the hive, and on the rest I've had open feeding available for the bees. I put a few gallons in each apiary for the bees to open feed on. I know that just about all of the apiaries have a little bit of natural pollen coming in, and I think once we get this little spell of warm weather coming in, then there's going to be quite a bit of natural pollen starting to come in. And from there on in, I don't expect that the bees will be foraging on the dry pollen substitute for much longer. But what they will do is I will be making more and more of those pollen patties, because just like this last week to 10 days or so, we've had this cooler, damper weather with a little bit of snow last night, but weather where the bees can't really get out and forage and even go for the pollen substitute. And if we get a spell like that later in April or in March, what's going to happen then is the colonies will immediately go into protein stress. And if they're in protein, because they bring enough pollen in, but they can't store enormous amounts of pollen in the spring. They've used up most of what they had over the winter, and they start consuming pollen very, very quickly. And so although we might have a field force bringing in lots of pollen, really when we're at full brood rearing time, it's only enough to last them a few days. And what will happen then is if they use up that pollen, the young adult bees don't have the resources of the protein to produce a lot of royal jelly. And that means they can't look after more than a certain amount of brood. And so what will literally happen is they will start to cannibalize eggs that the queen has laid. And if that doesn't trim back the brood production enough, they'll start cannibalizing young larvae as well, until they have left over enough brood that they can reasonably feed, given the resources they have left. Bees are very good managers of protein resources in the hive, and they can tell when they're going to run out. And some colonies work more on the assumption of being conservative about it, and some work on it a little bit more ambitious, hoping that the weather's going to improve. But all in all, what will happen is, without a pollen substitute in there, we may have ups and downs of brood rearing, where we have brood starting to be reared and then they eat some up, and then brood starting to be reared and eat some up as we get spells of poor weather. And that's where those pollen patties really pay dividends, because they keep a steady supply of that protein in, albeit not as good as natural pollen, but it keeps a steady supply of protein in there, and that allows the bees to continually rear the brood and gradually increase that amount of brood that they're rearing. So I'm looking forward to looking inside those hives and seeing what we actually are going to have. Then I'll have a good idea of how early some of my splits will be ready. Normally, I don't plan to have nukes ready until, say, the 15th of May. This year, we've had more warm spells in March and the first part of April than we had all of last year. So I don't recall any days in the high 50s or 60s early last spring. So I would say that we're likely to see colonies being stronger earlier this year. And so whilst I'm thinking that means a lot more splitting earlier and nukes available to sell earlier, what you folks might be wanting to think about is that might mean swarming earlier. Customers don't stop, so excuse me 1 second. Hello. Right, yes, so as I had such good survivorship, I've got to also be ready with considerably more boxes than I have right now on stock, because the single frame hives, of which I have a good 50 of them, I'd say. I have to double check. There's a good 50 of them. They are going to need, most of those are going to need a deep super on in the next two weeks or so, maybe 3. The many of the other hives that I've got, particularly those hives that overwintered with a single deep and a medium or something like that, well, I'll be reversing the brood chambers, but that doesn't leave me much growth room, so I'll be putting a second deep on those, because what I need them to expand into is deep combs, so I can make my nukes up, because I use deep frames in my nukes. So once I know what sort of workload I have ahead of me, then I've got to start recruiting my helpers. I've got some volunteers lined up and 1 or 2 people I can call upon with some experience that can help me do these splits. And because it's a pretty darn labor-intensive process in the spring, and only one of me is just not enough. Who wants 2 bee whisperers, for goodness sake? One bit of good news is I got my second vaccine last week, so as of next week I'll be fully inoculated to fight off coronavirus. As it happens also, it's my wife's birthday next week, and so we're having a few of our kids coming round. In fact, all 4 of our boys are coming up, and some of my daughters-in-law and prospective daughters-in-law and my grandson. Now, I don't know if Oliver, who's 3 years old, wants to go into a beehive yet, but I will be offering at any rate. I do have a bee suit suitable for a 3-year-old, so if that's the case, that'll make an interesting video for sure. I may not send that video to everybody, I might just keep it for me. Also found, in terms of making these supers, that I've got to do just a couple at a time, 2 at a time. I think I'm going to limit myself to, because on previous years when I was making a whole load of them, and that's also why I'm standing up here on a box right now, as normally I should be this high, and if you're trying to do hammer nails in at this height, it gets your shoulder really badly. And for the last couple of years I need physical therapy on that shoulder, because I realized that I was getting like a repetitive strain on there and doing this, which is no good for that shoulder. So I'm up higher, and I'm not going to be making 6 or 7 without stopping. I'll do 2, and then I'll go on to something else and come back and do another 2, and then come back and do another 2. But if I do too many, that gets all that shoulder sore. As it is, this shoulder is now sore, but not from this. It's been sore all winter, so I'm just falling apart. That's the problem with being 60 something. Thinking about it though, being 60 something is not all that bad. It certainly beats the alternative. Time for a rest now. Keep the old shoulder working properly. Don't want to need physical therapy just before I have to work with all the bees now, do I? So, looking forward to this work this spring. Pretty shortly, I'm going to be recommending that those of you with more than one hive, or it's not your first year with beekeeping, start thinking about diversifying your management techniques of your hives. I always recommend for a beginner to start with 2 deeps as their brood chamber, because a bigger colony gives you a more robust colony, and it's more forgiving of making some minor mistakes. And also they're much less likely to starve in the winter or other times of the year. But a lot of folks also don't make enough honey to be happy with what they thought they would get relative to what they thought they'd get anyway. And if making honey is one of your priorities this year, and you've got more than one colony, I'm really going to suggest that you diversify a little bit in your management techniques. And that'll be to run at least one, maybe more than one, of your colonies as a single brood chamber. And I'll be doing videos from about May onwards about running colonies as single brood chamber hives as opposed to double brood chamber hives. But single brood chamber hive, at least the way I'm going to do it, it's not going to be single brood chamber the whole time. It'll be double brood chamber at part of the time, and then going down to single brood chamber. The upside of that is that you will almost guaranteed make a lot more honey. The downside is that you will almost guaranteed have to feed a lot more sugar syrup in the fall. But that's not a bad thing, because if you're getting honey instead of sugar syrup going into the, if you're paying for your honey with sugar syrup going into the hive, it makes very good dollars and cents value at any rate. And also the bees do very well at overwintering on sugar syrup. The other positive about running as a single brood chamber management is your mite control, because your mite treatments will be even more effective in a single brood chamber managed colony than in a double brood chamber managed colony, because your brood is much more compact and you're going to be putting your mite treatments right where all that brood is in the most effective manner possible. So that'll be something that's coming up later, but something to think about now in terms of what equipment you want to have ready and that sort of thing. And just let me know in the comments below if running single brood chamber management is something that you're looking forward to doing a little bit this year, because I'll certainly be intending to help you out with that. Anyway, I'm going to go in, have a cup of coffee. I've been doing more stuff up until now. I think my wife's due home from school shortly, so I will go and download this video, get working on that, and when she comes home, it's time for a cup of tea. So I hope you found that of a little bit of use. It's more in terms of getting my thoughts ready, and hopefully it will inspire you to get some of your planning ready. We're going to have a nice spell to work with the bees later this week, and I can't wait to get into those brood chambers and show you what's happening in there. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.